Welcome back to the show where we dive deep into the currents of human-centered design and the waves of innovation shaping our future. I'm your host, Jerry Scullion, and today we have a truly enlightening episode just for you. Now, in a world that's constantly shifting beneath our feet, how do we keep our balance? How do we remain true to ourselves when the ground rules keep changing? And joining us today is April Rinne, a renowned futurist and advisor whose insights on the Flux mindset are reshaping how we think about stability, change, and personal growth. April brings to the table a profound understanding of how authenticity and embracing our deepest, sometimes most challenging stories can not only foster connection, but also equip us with the strength to face an uncertain world. She's here to share how this mindset isn't just a tool for personal development, but a crucial strategy for rethinking government, borders, identity, and trust. Now, before we jump in, a quick reminder: if you're looking to deepen your practice in human-centered design and connect with other change makers, consider joining our community at thisishcd.com. It's a vibrant space where you can continue your learning journey and strive towards becoming the best human-centered designer that you can be. Visit our website at thisishcd.com. Now, let's get started. Why is it important, do you feel, to be authentic and not have two versions of yourselves?
Oh, such a good question. I continue to be more and more stunned by how many people don't feel like they can be themselves, or they have these double lives or triple lives, depending on, how many different persona they want to present to the world. And if we talk about being our better self, our best self, our full self, whatever that might be, it's almost like categorically impossible when you've got different versions of yourself. And what I find is when you're presenting a version of many to the public, obviously you're hiding some piece of that. It's not, none of those are your full self.
Yeah.
And so you're always going to feel a bit like incomplete. And so for me, the authenticity, it's not that you share everything all at once, but to be able to walk the talk of particularly what I'm doing, on change and uncertainty, and how we show up for change, how we show up for uncertainty, how we show up for life.
Yeah.
If I don't actually model that, and if I don't walk my own talk and be fully me, then not only do I look like a complete hypocrite, but I'm also not able to help people in the ways that I'm able to, in the ways that I would like to.
Do you think there's a certain aspect as well of privilege to be able to do that in the modern world? I'd love to get your take on that, because the future of workplace is something that I feel like could probably, stir the pot a little bit, get a little bit of interest into the conversation from your experience in that space. I'm concerned that there might be a certain amount of privilege about being able to show up and being yourself, especially for emerging talent in the design world, or just generally in professionalism, not being able to be, kind of their full self, to hold back in order to get a job. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, and let's talk about this, because I think, privilege is a word and a dynamic and an issue on so many levels. And I actually have gone not overboard. I've spent a lot of time kind of unpacking, even in my own work, and particularly my work, which the first 15 years of my career were focused on global development, in particular working with the economically active poor around the world. So have lived and worked in urban slums, have lived and worked with people who never, they never mind college, they didn't get an elementary school education.
Yeah.
And looking at access to finance and how many of them are actually designed out of the financial system altogether. They're designed out of the education system. They are designed out of the systems, plural, of leadership. They don't meet any of the criteria we think of traditionally as what great leaders have, etc. And yet, what I was finding across the board, that is where the best entrepreneurs are. That is the kind of leadership that a world in flux demands, in terms of when you think of, and here it's where sometimes it's the economically active poor or it's refugees. That is actually the most, those individuals often have a much closer relationship to change and uncertainty than those people who would have more privilege and be in these protected ivory towers or whatever.
Characteristic.
So
Yeah.
there's that piece of privilege. The other piece I want to bring up is when we talk about privilege, there are so many kinds of privilege. And we often talk about, obviously access to education or the color of your skin or how much financial privilege you have.
Yeah.
There's the privilege of being born into a loving, caring family. There's the privilege of having stable mental health. There are all these different types of privilege. Some are more visible than others. But I say this because I have been extremely privileged in many ways, no question. And I try to not just own that, but to be very aware and humble and forthright about that. At the same time, many people would say, and this typically comes up in like, how did I get interested in flux and change? And I say, well, it's like my story. When did I really get interested in this? It's not about my resume. It's not about all of those traditional hallmarks of privilege. It is the story of when I was 20 and I was at university and I was halfway around the world. So there's privilege baked into all of that. But I got the phone call that both of my parents had died in a car crash.
Wow.
And that is where my story begins. And so you can say, oh my gosh, I mean, that's like the antithesis, like privilege, but then you go through something like that. And that was my baptism, my entry into this world in flux was when I lost my family.
Yeah.
I lost my home. I lost my sense of, I think, identity, sense of self. I lost my support system. I lost what I thought my future was going to look like. And so I bring this up because I think this word privilege it's a really loaded term. It's really important to understand and to recognize that each person. So for me, did I hide that story about my parents? I mean, for a long time, I wanted to talk about it. I was very open to talking about it, but like employers didn't want to hear it. People were afraid to hear it. They ran for the door. And yet, as I've shared it more and more over the years, so actually sharing that piece that people would say is like not, and it's anything but privilege, it's kind of hardship. That's what makes me full. That's why people actually are interested in what I have to say. And so I think that the more we can share those deeper, more difficult stories, because everyone has them, and I think the less often underprivileged you'll have those stories, that is actually a strength. That is actually something that the world needs to hear more about.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
and I guess my question comes from the place of, social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, this self of, or the state of kind of like having to project a certain type of lifestyle and dynamism around how we actually operate. And that creates a stress. And like being able to be authentic to yourself and saying, actually, you know what, I'm going to post something that's really from the heart today. I don't really care because I'm in my mid-40s. I'm working. I'm privileged in that sense. But not everyone can do that. Like, not everyone has that situation, and that's where the question came from. It was less around, race in that aspect, and how you actually have to attract that kind of that work. I guess, like if you want to think about it just through the lens of the workplace.
Yeah, well, and I'll bring this up because I think too, and I'm very aware, and not to make this too self-referential, and we can talk about examples that are more general or examples that are third person.
Yeah.
But I do think about the fact that like when my parents died, and 20 is a really interesting age, right?
Yeah.
Because I was old enough to be able to care for myself day to day, but young enough that like my career hadn't started. But this was before the era of lots of LinkedIn posting and Facebook and all the rest. And I was able to keep that part private, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think now about, would I have been able to share like the deepest, darkest days, the mud that you have to walk through, the really hard times. And frankly, for my own, and I think it's different for each person, but for my own grief journey, there would have been a part of that to be able to connect with others that would have been really helpful. And a part of that would have been absolutely toxic in terms of I actually needed to do this work privately, internally. But it was all very, very messy. And so I do think, I mean, I don't know that there's one answer. I think there's a pretty universal definition of what it means to be authentic. But
Yeah.
for each person, when we think about whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, we think about your age, your past history, that everyone's going to set that sweet spot of how much of themselves they want to share with the world, I think
Hmm.
a little bit differently.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much to unpack in that. And we've
Mm.
jumped straight into a big topic. If we were to take a step back, April, just for, a brief introduction to who you are, we mentioned Jerry, that's Jerry Michalski. He's been on the podcast in the last couple of months for people to think, because there's another Jerry floating around this podcast, not me, it's Jerry McGovern, who's in Spain. But Jerry Michalski is, close friend of Dave Gray and probably Mike Parker as well.
Yeah,
So there's a
Mike
whole kind of
Parker also.
there's a
There's a
whole kind of
whole
little
small but
pocket of
mighty posse of good humans.
yeah, absolutely. But how would you describe what you do? Imagine you're at a dinner party, you're sitting beside the next person, and they say, "Oh, I'm an accountant." And how do you respond to that question? And they say, "And
Yeah,
what do you do, April?"
I think it's fun because for most of my career until about 5 years ago, I would have to say like, well, I'm an advisor and I'm a lawyer and I invest from time to time and I was a travel guide and oh, I do handstands. And they'd be like, I'm sorry, we asked you what you do.
Can I move?
And thankfully, yeah. So this actually just want to plant a seed. Maybe we come back to it because it definitely relates to the future of work and the future of talent and career development. I like to always call it, and it's part of my work as well. I've never sought to climb a career ladder or pursue a linear career path. It has always for me been about creating and curating a career portfolio. So all
Mm.
of those things I just talked about, they're all in my portfolio. They're all central to what I do and they all fuel me in different ways. But in terms of what I would do now, I'm often referred to as the Flux lady, which I think is fascinating. But it is, what do? I focus on all things Flux. Now, Flux is
The
not
flux
just
capacitor
change.
is the first thing that comes into my mind. The
Sorry?
flux, the flux capacitor from Black to the Future.
Your flux, and I love this, Back to the Future, 40 years later.
Yeah.
It is one of my favorite words. I have what's called a fluxicon, which is my flux lexicon. And your flux capacity is actually your capacity to deal with not just change, but constant, relentless change and uncertainty.
Okay.
This world in flux, this future in flux, this future of work in flux. And so that means I am known mostly as a futurist, an advisor, a speaker, author. I'm that self-contained, I'm independent professional, but that is my North Star. And so I'm leading and advising teams, organizations, leaders as to how to better show up for and navigate and lead through this world in flux.
So I'm on your website straight away. I'm stuck, and you hear now at the moment that's me and your Google Analytics.
All right.
That's the one person there. Okay, there's probably more than one. But talk to me about this flux mindset, because it's straight away caught my attention. Tell me, you mentioned there about the peaks and troughs, and living amongst constant change and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a really nice kind of phrase that sums up the change making kind of mindset. What's your definition of your flux mindset?
Yeah, so the definition, and then I want to come back to the context of how I arrived at it and why it's helpful, why it matters. So this is all about your relationship to change. And I want to come back to the difference between change management and having a change mindset. So this flux mindset. But the flux mindset is essentially the ability, the state of mind, the mental muscle, if you will, that allows you to see all change. And we probably want to unpack the word change because we love it and we hate it and it's hard and awful and it's yet beautiful and magical and it's all these things at once. So it's the capacity, the mental muscle that can see all change. So whether that's quote unquote good change, bad change, expected change, unexpected changes, but it's especially the changes you don't control and the changes you didn't see coming. So that flux, it's the ability to see all of those changes as opportunities to learn and grow and improve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's lots to unpack in that. Where did this come from in your own perspective?
So
Obviously, you've
this
asked that question. That segue has been done before, I'm sure. But
yeah, and usually sometimes I do it before, but like I want to provide this context because it's helpful, like anyone tuning in where they can just listen and reflect and think about examples or moments in time where this has happened to them or their colleagues, or they've been observing a conversation. Like everybody's like, you're right. So it also, I just want to say, going back to some of my earlier work in global development and different cultures, for the last 25 plus years, I've been trying to pay really good attention and take really good notes around how humans react and respond and ultimately navigate change. And I've done that. For me, my real, I guess one of my unique features is that I have had a very global career. So I've worked, traveled in more than 100 countries.
Wow.
And I've been looking at how different cultures approach the unknown. And I bring all this up because I've been noticing patterns that show up. And one of the patterns that led me to this mindset is exactly what we've been talking about. In modern society, we focus so much on, in the business world, certainly, change management. And like there is a change, and I'm going to have my framework or my flow chart or my 6-point checklist. And you're going to give me this change, and I'm going to put it into my framework. And at the end of these 6 steps, this change will be, managed, solved, done. We can check it off our list and move on. And I did this again. I saw these systems, these change management systems in companies, in governments, in nonprofits, in all different kinds of markets and sizes and all of that. And I want to be clear, like, these are helpful tools. I am not saying that change management is bad or flawed. No, it's a helpful tool. However, it doesn't acknowledge or work like the world that we live in works.
100%.
And so I started getting really frustrated. I was having these conversations. I would be like advising a startup and advising a government that wanted to work together, but there was massive tension and friction because they had very different views of change. They had different views on the pace of change, the value of change, how change should look and feel and be managed and all the rest. And what I realized was that change management is useful, but it's completely incomplete for the world we live in today, because it eliminates the human experience of change. And that is all about your mindset. That is all about, how do you feel about change? How are you showing up for it? How are you seeing it? And I kept pulling on that thread for a long, long time. And that ultimately led me to develop not just the concept, but the actual, like, how do you build and groove and strengthen a Flux mindset?
It's really good. You mentioned governments there, and that's a lot of my work. I absolutely adore working with governments. It aligns to my purpose, aligns to the work that I do with the podcast and the network. From your perspective and your experience, when you're working and you're advising governments, what does the future of government look like in terms of being able to evolve and adapt based on ever-growing needs of society?
Gosh, the future of government, that is $1 trillion, euro, whatever.
I want it in 50 words or less, only joking. But it is a huge question. But
I just want to back up and say, like, in fact, I love that we share this love, this commitment to government, to public sector, to public service work, and like really serving humanity, serving communities, serving people and places. Like, that's why I went to law school. I didn't want to necessarily be a lawyer. I was really interested in public policy. And then that evolved into public policy around things like innovation and disruptive innovation, which is code speak also for change. And so I've really been peeling back the layers of this onion to get to Flux. But in fact, the role of government and the role of public policy has been a real important guide for me, because I think we will often say, like, the world is changing so much faster than government. Government just can't keep up. It's slow. It's clunky. Like, it's really easy to be critical about it. And yet, government is designed to change more slowly. And the law, too, is changed. They're designed to change more slowly. They change when it is so clear that society has moved on
Yeah.
But they need to update. Now, that is by design, because if the whole world worked like a startup, we would be breaking things left, right, and center every day, right?
Yeah.
So there's
I
this
love that.
tension. So the future of government, what I love, and I still, the Flux mindset, it's helpful for all organizations, all people, all cultures, like everyone's struggling, everyone can improve, not always in the same way, but everyone can improve. So government, I mean, for me, if I'm very selfish about this, I'm like, across government, we need to bring this concept of a Flux mindset more to bear.
Mm.
But also, it's really about, gosh, there's so many levels here where I'd love to dive in, because on the one hand, it's looking at government's nimbleness, and I might say agility, but its capacity to change and
Yeah.
to evolve more quickly. That's one piece. I think there's also a really interesting conversation around things like borders and geopolitical borders, and how we think about, how we conceive not just government, but identity in the future. And so the
Yeah.
future of government, I think, looks quite different in terms of the more permeable membranes we have when it comes to things like identity. And when it comes to things like, some issues are hyper local. Other issues are very much global. You know that. Like we
Yeah.
know this, and yet we haven't designed government to adapt to that. So I don't know which of those threads you want to
Oh,
pull
no,
on.
absolutely. But how far in the future can a futurist go?
Well, this is one fun thing
Mm.
that's been said. So, Jerry, you mentioned Jerry Mikulski earlier.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but he's my husband. So,
Yeah.
my husband and I have been guests on this podcast, which I love, and we do different things. But people know both of us as futurists who
Okay.
run different businesses. But needless to say, we talk a lot, and conversations at home are quite interesting and so forth.
Yeah.
But how far do you look in the future? And one time, someone referred to us. They were like, Jerry is the low beams and you're the high beams in a car, right?
Okay.
And when you think about it, and that's one of the things I really love about Jerry, he's looking really far into the future, like
Mm.
beyond a person's lifespan, which has all kinds of fascinating questions we can ask. But also for some people, it's hard to imagine, because they're like, if it's not going to affect me, why should I care? It's like, well,
Yeah.
because it is going to affect your kids and grandkids and the world at large. I would be considered someone who's looking more, the high beams, the shorter term.
Okay.
So for me, I will look at things, let's say beyond 20, 30 years. But I find that for most people, something that they can grasp is within a generation.
Yeah.
Where, so not right or
Within a
wrong.
generation, but within this generation, if you look at, say, the US government,
Mhm.
okay, where it's currently at the moment, like there's a lot going on there at the moment,
Yeah.
especially this week.
This week, let me tell you.
But so for context, Joe Biden has just stood down in the presidential race. We've got Kamala Harris now is going to lead the Democratic vote. But what does it look like in situations like that, where obvious change, hopefully for the better, is going to happen in the US? If it doesn't, where does this flux mindset, how does that work into the kind of Pandora's box that is most likely going to be opened?
Oh yeah. Oh no, Jerry, like this, and let me just be really clear.
Yeah.
I have experience with, like, public policy and public servants and
Hmm.
that sort of thing. I did not expect that I would be pulled into so many conversations about politics in
Mm.
Flux, right? Like, the utility of my body of work and my book is greater than I actually ever imagined for it to be. And I say that just as a fun, like, I mean, I get asked, and it really became clear to me when, and I say this in a very heavy-hearted way, when war in Ukraine broke out,
Yeah.
because I was immediately fielding questions of, like, how can a Flux mindset help war? And I was like, okay, because it was Flux, right? It was massive uncertainty, massive unknowns, and a lot of fear. And I thought, I did not write this book about war, and yet it actually has some utility here. So I share this just because I am being drawn into conversations I didn't envision having. I am thrilled that I can be of use and have something worthy to contribute. but even the one about politics. So for me, it's not about a particular political party. It's not about an election. It's not even about a particular country. One thing I have learned, and 2024 was the first year that I sensed people finally acknowledged, because my thesis has always been, it's evolved. I mean, it's been refined over the years, but it's always been that the future, there's more change and uncertainty and flux ahead than less. And as a result, humans are not very good at change and uncertainty. And so I don't see any signs of change and uncertainty relenting or stopping or ceding.
Yeah.
And so unless and until that happens, we all need to massively update and improve and up-level our relationship with change and our mindset with change, right? So 2020 obviously gave us a kind of crash course in that. That was the first year I saw people saying like, oh, maybe she has, I've been saying this for quite a while, but they were like, maybe what she's saying
has a point.
We should pay attention to it, right? And so the last few years, I don't want there to be more flux in the world. But insofar as there is, and again, the thesis is playing out. So you had 2021 of like, oh, well, okay, we're in this pandemic, but we'll get out of it and then we'll move on. And then it's like people starting to realize like, okay, it's not about a pandemic actually. And it's not about an election. It's like there's on every level, personal, professional, organizational, societal, like take your pick on any given day. It's just like mega flux.
Yeah.
But I bring this up because 2024, January 1st, I do remember people, certainly here in the US and elsewhere from what I gather as well, where they're like, oh, you don't need to tell me that 2024 is going to be flux. Like all we need to think about is the presidential election. We can tell this is going to be a year in which we're going to have a lot of flux to deal with. So I bring this up because all year I've been tracking and pacing and tracking and pacing. And it's like what we really struggle with is just the not knowing. And so however it goes between now and November, whatever happens in November, there's going to be more flux ahead.
Yeah.
And it's that piece. And what I like is this transcends politics. It's like, how are you going to show up for everything that happens in your life? Now, we can certainly talk about what are the scenarios where we could anticipate more stability, where we could anticipate more coherence, where we could anticipate, when you say you're going to do something, you actually do it, or having singular, consistent, coherent messaging. That's all really helpful for tamping down that uncertainty.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that on the global stage, there won't continue to be, national and global stages, there won't continue to be just a lot of unknowns.
Yeah.
Right? So to me, I am like nervous and I am like, oh my gosh, right? I need my flux mindset every day. And at the same time, the flux mindset actually brings a great sense of calm and peace. Not global peace, but like you're rooting within how you're showing up. And a lot of it is about this dynamic between hope and fear and how we see certain changes from a place of hope versus from a place of fear. And it's not about changes you like or don't like. There can be a change you really don't like, but you can also show up with hope. There can be a change that's good for you that you still see from a place of fear.
Yeah.
So it just depends.
So if you look at 2020, the COVID pandemic, when it hit, it basically broke boundaries, broke borders, broke ways of working. It broke all the conventions that really underpin society for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And then what's kind of happened is we've kind of leaned back a little bit more. This is my perception on things, where we haven't really taken any of those lessons and applied them and future-proofed ourselves. So what I mean by that in terms of remote working, suddenly they brought back these requirements to come back into the office. But the speed at which government had to design and improve services had to get quicker. It had to speed up. Whereas now it seems like the cadences fall back into the sort of the BAU, the business as usual kind of approach to things. With that kind of change that is most likely going to happen in the US, is it a case of the future just requiring government? I know you said there about the two different ends of the spectrum, government having to be slower, But is it a case now that governments are going to have to step up and be a little bit more proactive at being able to respond to this flux, if you want?
Yeah, well, and I wanted to, this is such a great question. I'm like, oh my gosh, there are like 10 questions in that. All of them worthy of digging into. And just to clarify though, when I say that it's not, I don't want it to sound like a blanket statement of government is slower or that that's a good
we're just focusing on the US government.
Yeah, well, but the government that there's a model that dates back to the 1980s. It's called pace layering. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's this sense of like not everything changes at the same pace. And I love that. And when I say government is slower, it's like by design, we have certain institutions in our societies around the world that have been designed to provide, to be more of those meters of stability. And then we've got other layers of society that have been designed to just change more quickly. Yeah. And so I think those layers will continue. But I think it really requires a reckoning and a reassessment of what issues with which government is tasked with handling. Some of those issues actually show up at different layers. So if you like the issue is changing at a much faster layer than the layer at which government is designed.
True.
Then you start coming to like, oh, well, would that be delegation of certain powers? Would that be rethinking who's part of the decision-making process? Yeah. Would that be solving some of these problems through partnerships so it's not all on government's shoulders? I mean, there's so many different ways we can think about how do you create a system that is more nimble and more responsive in real time?
When you look at, we're hanging on governments for a little bit longer here, so
great.
Hold on to your seats. When you look at global governments, like governments out there at the moment that seem to have grasped the flux mindset. I have to be very careful how I say that, flux. You know, there's too many. I don't want to give too many flux away. But if you look at, say, the UK government, I want to understand a little bit more around your thoughts on who's doing it well and who seems to be able to be better prepared for the future based on your own kind of framework, if you want.
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. And I won't say, I mean, there are, so couple different directions I need to head here because there's a key piece of my framework that we haven't introduced yet, which will help me answer this question. And so let me just do very briefly. You've got this flux mindset, and opening a flux mindset, you know, that's acknowledging that your relationship to change can improve, that you can show up better. Like that's like the foundation. But then people say, well, like, how do you do that? Like, what do you do? And so the next level, the second step, if you will, is to harness the mindset in order to develop and strengthen what I call your 8 flux superpowers. Okay. So there are these superpowers that bolt onto the mindset. Yeah.
Tell us what these superpowers are.
Well, each one of them bolts onto a sub-theme around change. So one is about the pace of change. One is about your relationship to control. So the changes you do and don't control. Another one is just the sheer fact of not knowing and how that unravels us. Another is about the role of trust, etc. I bring this up. So these are the practices, the skills that we can practice and strengthen every day that will help us, again, strengthen that mental muscle, that mindset. I bring this up because in your question, there isn't one government in the world that's like, oh, they're just good at this. They've figured it all out.
Yeah.
There are governments and there are companies and organizations. For most institutions, they tend to start by being really strong or investing a lot in one of these sub-themes, one of these superpowers. Like I can tell you the kinds of places that have really excelled at, and again, it's not typically institutional design. A lot of it is culture. Where cultures that are really good at, so the one around pace of change, it's something that I call running slower. So the faster the pace of change in the outside world, pace of change, the more important it is to better be able to mitigate and moderate and understand your inner pace of change. So whether or not you are getting completely caught up in that fast pace of change, or whether or not you actually have the skills and practices that allow you to slow down. Right? Now, there are some places on the planet that do that extraordinarily well.
Name
And
them.
my favorite in this regard would actually be the Netherlands.
Okay.
And the Netherlands, and it's not because of governmental design, although that does factor in, and we can look at things like how much holiday do you get and how have you designed public policy design definitely factors in. But one of my favorite examples of all is just this concept that you have in the Netherlands, which is called Nixon, Niksen. Have you heard of it?
No.
So Nixon, it's a word. Literally, Nixon means do nothing. Now,
Nice.
Nixon is not laziness. The Dutch are one of the most productive societies on the planet, right? It's not about not working hard. It's not about not knowing how to run.
Yeah.
Nixon is a collective, culture-wide recognition and appreciation and prioritization of the importance of rest. It's a reframing of rest, and it's a celebration, not just of rest as like, take it easy, but that only when you're able to rest and replenish are you able to have growth and innovation and new ideas and great leadership and transformation.
Totally.
And
Which
so when
that
you
echoes
live in
Mike
a country,
Parker, by the way. That's
sorry?
a lot of Mike Parker's thinking.
Yes, very much so. And
Yeah.
so unless you can't run full speed if your battery is drained, a car
Yeah.
can't do that. A person can't do that. A company can't do that. A government can't do that. So I bring this up because that's not like an institution didn't say we're going to design a policy around that. But culturally, this concept of Nixon has existed for centuries. And I often, when people learn about it, they're like, I just want to go experience that. Like living in a culture where that is the norm, that is the rule, not the exception,
Yeah.
creates a very different set of systems around which you're designing. And actually in English, so the word to nix something, we say we're going to nix it, we're not going to do it. That actually comes from Nixon.
Okay, there's Nixer as well.
Yeah.
One of the pieces that we're talking here about governments as well, the sudden speed, that sudden increase that's required for a government to respond to that change. When you're working in government, that tension is huge. So you bring in something that needs to get done, and they're used to have this kind of self-serving kind of looking at each other, kind of going, I am on my lunch.
Yeah, like
I am
we
not
got time,
responsible.
right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, no, we don't have time. Yeah.
So one of the questions I get asked by governments when I'm training is, how do you get this adopted? This new way of working, like service design, like I teach, when I bring in complexity and complexity theory into the work, they just look at me and they're like, how do you instill this kind of fire to move quicker in an organization that is typically responsible for going slower?
Yeah, well, and I'm remembering.
You get my point.
Yeah, well, and I'm remembering I didn't fully answer a question you had asked earlier as well. This whole sense, and part question, part comment, but I just want to build on it because it relates to this one as well, which is around just this idea of like, what did we actually learn over the last few years?
Yeah, what have we done?
Because, well, I hear from people pretty much every day, and they're like, we're so great at change. Like, look at all we did back to counter a pandemic. Look at how much has changed in the last few years. And I always have to say, like, respectfully, yes, many parts of the world look different. Aspects of life look different now than they did before March 2020. I said, but remember, we had our backs against the wall, kind of life or death for many people. We didn't have a choice. And yes, we adapted. That is a very different situation than choosing to put yourself in a place of changing even when it's not comfortable, changing when it's not life or death, evolving, iterating, keeping up with things. That is not the norm of human nature. So this whole sense of, we changed a lot because we were forced to, because we had no choice, versus, to your point, well, now what? Once that immediate life or death threat has passed for the most part, like, then what? And what you find is that pendulum definitely goes back towards the center. Sometimes it goes beyond it. Sometimes it gets stuck. I feel like the last few years, many people have they do have a much deeper appreciation for change, and in particular, an awareness of how much change we don't control.
Mm-hmm.
However, that hasn't necessarily led to long-lasting, sustainable, meaningful changes in behavior.
Yeah.
And so that's the part of Flux where I'm like, I'm so glad Flux mindset existed. And some people have that more, but it's not like the work ever finishes. It's not like you get past one crisis and you go back.
Yeah.
So to your question, it relates to this question as well, which is like, oh, well, we did that because we ran faster because it was an emergency, but now we're done. And so we're not going to have to go back to that. How do you start to instill that? And I look at this so much from the metaphor of a muscle, right? You didn't have strong muscles. All of a sudden you had to go to the gym like 5 times a day to build this muscle so that you could react to an emergency. You finish that and you're like, yeah, I don't want to go back to the gym.
Yeah.
And so those muscles are going to get loose and weak again. And so for me, this idea of a mindset and these superpowers, these are muscles that you need to practice every day, just like you would exercise your physical muscles. But when you do that, you build a baseline level of strength. So your question almost for me implies, and not to put words in your mouth at all, but like where I would take this is, what are those small, achievable, daily practices, those reps we can do that are not threatening and they're not particularly hard, but each time it's actually building a little bit of a muscle.
Absolutely.
And so you want to design that kind of low stress, low impact, if you will, exercise into your professional life.
Yeah.
That then little by little actually becomes quite strong and much more agile, much more nimble.
So is that where the likes of agile practices are really nice to
Yeah.
cycle? I know I don't mean to put words in your mouth this time, but like in agile, that whole kind of scrum and stand up.
Yeah.
They do create an accountability of what you've done, any blockers and so forth.
Yeah, and I do get into conversations about like agile. Is that what you're talking? And it's like there is a whole other universe which is agile and agile teams and agile flows, and I'm somewhat versed in it. I'm not an expert in it by any means. There is, I think, the definition of agile and agility and resilience is another one.
Capital A and small a, like capital A.
Right. Well, and also though things like resilience, adaptability. I mean, these are all words that we've imbued with some kind of meaning. They are quite similar. Like they run in packs, if you will. I would not say that agile, capital A, agile practices or flows are necessarily what I would call fluxy, right? It's not like there's a direct correspondence there, but those systems, whether you call them agile or not, those systems that are iterative, those systems where you have things that cascade, that it's like that are just doing much more of the feedback loop. The world of like polarity management is actually really interesting here too. Like it's the feedback loops where you're able to take in information and respond to it in more in real time, but also in ways that are lighter weight but super flexible. That is both agile and that would be also fluxy. But for me, the fluxy and fluxiness and this whole vocabulary around flux, which I love, there's a difference between fluxiness and just like resilience or adaptability or agility, because I'm really talking about how do we see change and uncertainty. What's how do we see it? How do we show up for it?
Yeah.
And how do we learn to see it? How do we strengthen our muscles so that we see all change, again, whether you love it or hate it, all change, all sources of uncertainty as opportunities for growth?
Could you tell us, like you said, there are like certain exercises, the low reps. You kind of hinted that you might have had some suggestions.
Yeah, well, and again, each of the suggestions I will have they tend to be more specific to each superpower. Okay. So the run slower is about the pace of change. There's what's called see what's invisible, which is about our vision and our perceptions of change. The superpower, which is called get lost, that is about stretching beyond your comfort zone and improving your relationship to the unknown. There's another one that's about trust. So each of these superpowers has its own set of practices. So like, what are the little ways that you can learn to build trust, right?
Yeah.
That's different than like, what are the little ways you can learn to slow your pace or become aware of your pace?
Yeah.
Right. So, in my book, like I have series of, like it's written to be very practical and like handy. But I have quite a few of those, and it's everything from breath work to noticing different things when you travel, to how you approach strangers. I mean, lots of things. None of these practices, they don't cost any money. They don't require actually any technology unless you choose to insert that, but you don't need technology. They're just very much like practice that you can integrate into your daily life.
Okay. So I'm looking at the book here at the moment.
One of the ones, so I'll always like just take trust, and we start getting into we think about trust kind of like change. We think of trust as if it's one thing, it's one word, so it's all the same. But it turns out that trust is super rich and complex and nuanced and complicated. And for example, there's a kind of trust that comes from your head, like a cognitive trust, and there's a kind of trust that comes from your heart, which is more of an emotional trust, right?
Yeah.
And most people have not thought about that before. Most organizations, sorry?
I was going to say, it's interesting to dissect trust.
Yeah. Well, in most organizations, they invest, like, your brain is like, do you show up on time? Do you deliver? Do you meet deadlines? Do you do high quality work? That's all good kinds of trust. That's all up here. That is not, can I trust that if I make a mistake, I can confide in you? Back to identity. Can I trust that I can share my full self with you?
Yeah.
Those are very different kinds of trust, right?
Yeah.
We treat them as one. And so I bring up these practices because there are practices for this. I'm not actually worried about the head kind of trust. When change hits, this part, the cognitive trust, is actually quite not easy, but it's much easier to put in place. Again, it's like operations. It's that's change management. It's the emotional trust that most organizations aren't really aware of. They're not investing in, but that's the trust that carries the day.
Yeah.
So things around, a lot of the practices are, I mean, it's as simple as strike up a conversation with a stranger and ask them these questions or what, or open the door for somebody, or pay for a stranger's coffee. Now, what is that? You're like, that's actually a small gesture of trust. That you're going to open a different kind of conversation, get to know someone you didn't know before. And it will appeal to your head, but it will really appeal to your heart.
Yeah.
And then we start to fear each other less, et cetera, et cetera. So I just bring that up because there's like a universe of ways to approach this. That's one example for that one superpower, which would then feed into your mindset.
Yeah. April, we're not going to wrap everything up in one podcast with you. You're what's known as a podcast disaster guest, because you've just got so much stuff. I have to stop myself from interrupting you. We're going to, if you are open for it, we'll have you back on, and we'll cover off more around the Flux superpowers. We just had Professor Neil Thiest back on last week. I don't know if you Neil Thiest. He's one of my new kind of, say new in the last couple of years, because we didn't get through everything, obviously, in his complexity world and his own story and stuff. But I'm going to put a link to the fluxmindset.com into the show notes. If you're watching it on YouTube, you just click in the description and you'll be taken to the book. I'm going to buy this book myself, and sometimes guests give them to me, but this one I'm going to buy, okay, folks, because one, I'm sold on what April's told me, and two, the website looks like there's a lot I can actually learn really quickly. So it's really well laid out. So check out the website as well, folks. April, best places for people to connect with you, to learn more about what you do. Give us a shout out for those links now.
Yeah, thank you. So for all things Flux, it is fluxmindset.com. And there's a list of the superpowers and the mind. Like, I've tried to make the core framework just easily available and accessible and fun to interact with. So that's for all things Flux. And then for all things April, the website is aprilrinne.com. And so it's RINNE. I'm happy to say I'm the only person with my name, so I'm really easy to find.
Yeah, no,
It's actually very, very nice. My last name is Finnish, so you can find me there. And then I'm April Rinne. Find me on LinkedIn. Please reach out, connect, follow. And I'm April Rinne on all social media channels as well, because there is only one me.
no one else is going to compete for it anyway. Well, look, April,
Exactly.
it's been fantastic speaking with you.
Thank you so much.
You know, I knew it was going to be a good conversation, and I was not disappointed. So, you know, some point in the next couple of months, we'll try and schedule another call to talk more around after I've gotten through the Flux mindset. Is that the name of the book? Just Flux.
It's just Flux, but Flux mindset at the core.
Yeah, pretty much. So listen, thanks so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I have thoroughly enjoyed myself as well. And yeah, thank you. And as I always like to say, like, mind the flux.
Great stuff. Thanks, April.
Thank you.